So we're starting now. And again, Niels, thank you so much. I think that last week's was brilliant. We've received a lot of feedback, of really good feedback, and we hope this one will go just as well this time around. So we're really excited about it. For anybody who wasn't around last time or completely forgot, I just want to remind you that Niels has been working in regenerative agriculture for 15 years. So he has a wealth of knowledge, and it's very varied. I mean, he has worked on, he's been a researcher, an advisor, an educator, a designer, a tree nurseryman. You can see why I had to write everything down, because it's a lot. And very, very different, not very different, but in many, many fields. So soils and holistic management, regenerative agriculture design, and focusing in general on agroecological systems that are low maintenance. So it's a really good chance, if you have an idea, to ask any questions you have. I'm also going to be attaching in the follow-up mails all of Niels' social media account, and also how to reach them if you want to be part of his newsletter. I highly recommend it. It's brilliant. And I think that's pretty much all from me. And without further ado, Niels, the stage is yours.
Great. Okay, thanks. We'll just go through these questions, I think, initially, and I'll try and interpret them as best I can. So maybe what I might do even is share the screen so you can see what I am looking at. Let's just get this up. Yes, okay. Right then, share the screen. So yeah, these are questions that were asked, last week. It's a nicer layout a minute ago, actually. So I'm gonna take us out of that. Yes, it is. Okay, so we're asking, based at the Wakelins farm example that we looked at what spacing between trees were the double rows of hazel and willow planted in the example farm in Suffolk? The answer is I'm not exactly sure, but they are pretty close. So the double row probably would be no more than a metre apart, I would say, in that situation. What is their average yield, dry matter or similar equivalent for each row? Ideally a figure in kilos per metre of double row or something similar. So I don't have that information to hand, but that information was gathered and is being gathered by the Organic Research Centre. Sally Westerway, I think, is leading on that. And they do have data quoting oven-dried tons or oven-dried kilos per tree, I think. And from that, you can extrapolate the number of trees and then the yield per row, basically. And yeah, I have actually sort of asked them sort of how that works out in terms of the spacing, but I think it's the easiest to work it out per linear meter of tree row in this case, because of planting of a given when we're establishing or doing a design for a planting, that's the first thing we need to do, is to establish how much length of row we have in total for any given tree species or mix of trees. So yep, that's that one. Otherwise, how soon after planting was the first coppicing undertaken, and does the yield rise with subsequent coppicing? Again, this is all fairly standard kind of short rotation coppice info. So definitely the Irish agricultural organisation, I think what Teagues, my Irish pronunciation is terrible. So they definitely have a few resources that you can refer to. Otherwise, yes, the willow will be coppiced probably 2 or 3 years earlier than the hazel. I think probably the willow would be 3 years to the first coppice, and the hazel would be 5 years or potentially a couple more. And then the hazel's in a 5-year cycle and the willow's in a 2-year cycle. But that's kind of up to you to an extent. Again, it depends whether you're trying to optimize for shelter, for browse, or for biomass, basically. How long do they anticipate to continue with coppicing before having to replant? I don't think that that's a short term. We're definitely thinking we're talking decades here, 40, 50 years. I think the main potential issue would be that some willow hybrids or otherwise planting willow hybrids as straights, they can be susceptible to disease. And in which case then, yes, I guess at some point, if that disease was so bad it would affect the yield basically going forward. But that said, if you're combining it with best practice grazing management, for example, or best practice soil management, I think that will basically contribute to the health and therefore the longevity of those plantings. And then the final question. So a key issue would seem to be how to protect young trees from grazing animals on the farm. We have Hampshire Downs and South Downs, and both seem intent on pruning leaves of trees, standing back on their legs to do so. Practical advice on how to protect them in an aesthetic and cost-effective manner would be appreciated. So I probably would need a little bit more information about this, but it sounds like from what you've described, these are hedges that are fenced using stock-proof, kind of permanent stock fencing, and in that case, yes, they obviously can stand on their back legs. So if we were moving to electric fencing, we'd pretty much eliminate that. And obviously, any electric fencing needs to be nice and hot and potentially 2-strand, for example. I think we need to mute some of the participants out there potentially. Other than that, what I would say is if your animals are seeking browse, basically, if they have a strong appetite for browse, basically, then we should be providing that, and we should be providing as much as possible. And that could be from existing hedges, for example. So using temporary electric fencing to fence in from existing hedges to allow those hedges to thicken out and to expand. And in the same way that we sort of looked at last week, we can potentially utilize kind of coppice rows for browse, basically. So let's just look at that now. Again, things like ivy and and willow will always be preferentially selected. And in this case, if it's hedge management, existing hedge management, then moving away from flailing and adopting coppicing management is one way to kind of maximize those gains, basically. And yes, the coppice will then avoid a browse line basically forming and it's sort of being browsed up. So we can kind of reset that every few years, depending on how rapid the species are that are growing. And then by moving away from flailing, we're basically producing, and as well as having sort of fence that is back from the hedge, we can then allow growth, basically. So we want to be ensuring rest periods with our existing hedges and any browsed silvopasture to allow those trees to sort of get a bit of a head up, basically. But I think that, one of the most important things really is where you're seeing a particular animal behavior. If they're seeking shelter, if they're seeking shade, for example, or they're seeking browse, we should make attempts to redesign the landscape or to manage the landscape or the farm in order to provide that for them, because they're almost certainly seeking particular nutrients, particular trace elements, or otherwise things like complex tannins. And there would be also an opportunity to include things like free choice minerals as a substitute for the browse, so kind of like ad lib buffet straights of minerals that are unmolassed. The animals can then choose from. But going forward, browse is kind of, I would say, is a superior, what's it called, intake for them, basically. Okay, so that is all the questions from last week. So, and if you're happy with that, I'll move on at this point.
Absolutely happy. Just to remind everyone, the chat functions where you can ask your questions, and we'll stop every now and then to address them. So feel free to make any comments or ask any questions in the chat function.
Great. Okay, thanks, Anna. And if you can make sure everyone's muted, that would be useful. There's definitely a few kind of like shufflings going on, which I think is a little distracting for most. So what we can look at today then, sort of following on from last week, and basically going beyond just straight row patterns, for example, looking a little bit at canopy density, looking at some more design presentations, how we can respond to land shape and slope, some pointers on establishment, planting and upcycling products, arisings or yields, and then a little bit of a sort of a design demo, how you might put together a design, in this case for like a sort of market garden / field scale horticulture operation, sort of 3 acres of horticulture, and how we can integrate trees into that, what it might look like. So the initial thing is to say that the work that we're doing now, with this planning, basically fits into a broader context or framework, and that's what I call the whole farm planning principles. And these follow on from things like the soil health principles and pasture management principles, but it really covers the sort of material and the physical and the infrastructure side of regeneration. And the ones we're going to focus on are from sort of eight onwards. So these are the ones that specifically refer to trees. So, yep, just to show that sort of the wider context into which this sits. So the first of these whole farm planning principles is to increase structural diversity on the farm. So we talked quite a bit about sort of, or we generally talk about diversity in pastures, for example, diversity in rotations, and the advantages that brings, and including trees into the interior of your sort of management operations, into the interior of the fields, as opposed to just on the periphery, yeah, like hedges are, for example. By integrating them into the interior or into the heart of your operation, then that diversity is going beyond just herbaceous. You know, when we're looking at sort of crops, what's it called, forages and sort of horticulture products, those are all herbaceous. So when we include the woodies, trees and shrubs, basically, we are increasing that diversity once more, basically adding a sort of whole new dimension, if you like. And why is that important? Well, fundamentally, your herbaceous plants, they associate with AM mycorrhizal fungi, yeah, whereas your trees and your woodies associate with EM mycorrhizal fungi. So where you have the trees and the open land, the herbaceous vegetation sort of meeting, yep, those mycelial mats will extend out and overlap. And where the mycelial mats overlap, you get a big nutrient bump, basically, because you've got that additional diversity. And this is why it's important for us as producers, basically, because as a diversity above ground, so diversity below ground. Yeah. So then we can also look at how that diversity is patterned, or how it's sort of structured, basically. So is it very regular and uniform, or is it non-uniform and irregular? Yep. But basically what we're looking to do here is to integrate trees into the interior of fields for maximum fungal effect and maximum edge effect benefits. And yeah, to look at integral rather than peripheral. So just to make this point about how different patterns look and how they sort of like manifest, here's an example of what some might call a sort of naturalistic pattern, but otherwise a sort of patchy or mosaic pattern. And again, this is made up of sort of 2 or 3 main landscape components, with the 2 being sort of the main ones being covered land, woodland, forest or treed areas, for example, and then open land, you know, the herbaceous grasslands and those kind of things, basically, with the potential also to be integrating where it occurs, riparian or open water. Yeah, and it's the synthesis of these 3 kind of broad types of land that can bring that structural diversity. So if we look at these images in a little more detail, you can see that we've got, you know, quite a lot of patchiness here. We've got sort of small amounts of trees sort of coming out into the open land, and we've got some of the sort of pasture kind of like penetrating into the woodland, and then obviously there's dense woodland behind, and then open pasture in between. And then this image again is even nicer. So we've got, you know, isolated clumps of trees or sort of copses, for example, what you might perhaps describe as a kind of parkland pattern, if you like, out here. And that sort of gives ways to sort of like sort of larger copses, or maybe you might call them spinneys, for example. And then obviously sort of like closed canopy woodland. But the important thing in this case is that there's no sort of hard line between one and the other. They sort of blend into each other, and they're blending into each other spatially, because obviously we're looking at a snapshot now, but they're also blending into each other temporarily, because these trees, these small trees that are out here in the open pasture, they're going to get bigger, for example, and likely gather more trees around them as they produce seed, for example. Yeah, so we'll get these clumps of trees that expand. Yep. And then we should also get a sort of hollowing out in the center of these woodlands as well. So you can see that the edge of the woodlands is expanding outwards, and the center of the woodlands is often opening outwards as well in a sort of natural succession situation, basically. But what we're looking at here is a very high structural diversity. Yeah, we've got a big mix of different trees and open land together, as opposed to these kind of row patterns that we were looking at last week, for example, where that structural diversity is quite low. That's not to say that we wouldn't look at those, but it's just really to understand this idea of structural diversity. Okay. So I guess the other thing that's worth mentioning, yeah, when we're talking about sort of how far does that edge effect extend, you know, when we've got rows of trees or clumps of trees, how far beyond the sort of extent of those plantings does the sort of effects reach into the open land, whether it be pasture or cropland? Well, for example, with beetle banks, they normally say it's about 50 meters. And again, these are sort of like flying insects or very mobile insects that are able to sort of move to and from. And obviously these sort of banks will also, if they include trees, will also provide habitat for birds as well. So let's look at canopy density now. And again, this is sort of more applicable for that sort of those distributed kind of patterns, those patchy patterns. And just to say that, like, you know, we're looking for a sort of, in an agroforestry situation, we're looking for an open canopy as opposed to a closed canopy. Yep. The closed canopy really would be what we would call forestry. And open, totally open, is obviously pasture or cropland, basically. So it's the blend of those two that we're looking for. So why do we want some cover? You know, what does the sort of the canopy bring? Well, it brings a little bit of microclimates to stock, so shelter and shade to stock, and also to grass. Yeah, it actually provides sort of a microclimate for grass. So often we see grasses growing earlier or later into the winter under trees, for example. and we often see better grass growth next to rows of hedges, for example, or in shelter. And I saw that very recently. You know, grass in the open pasture was maybe sort of like 3 foot high, for example, whereas a sort of, you know, maybe sort of 3 meter wide band of grass that was a good sort of foot and high taller next to the trees, basically. But obviously, if we've got too much density, well, that will then suppress the grasses, and you can see here where these um, spaces give way here in the center, as opposed to where we can see in the sort of distance. So the foreground is obviously quite dense shade, and the sort of the distance we can see sort of very light. So we can see like grass is dominating in the distance. But basically, the thing to say is that like these kind of considerations aren't really an issue with row patterns, and that's another reason why row patterns are, you know, they're quite convenient, they're quite simple to design, basically. So this is about, you know, where we're looking at dispersed and or grid patterns, basically. So here's a good example of where we're sort of looking at a closed canopy situation. So here in the foreground, yeah, we've got total shade suppression, and basically we've got like, you know, a small amount of shade tolerant broadleaves, and mostly otherwise mosses and just sort of not bare soil, but like, you know, kind of forest floor. And then here in the sort of, you know, off to the left, you know, that's where we've got quite a bit more light, and you can see there's quite a hard line in terms of sort of where the grasses are dominating and where they're shaded out, basically. So here's some like a distance a bit further away from that site we were just looking at. So this is what we might be looking at for things like wood pasture or parkland type plantings, you know, isolated trees or clumps of trees or wide spaced trees that are laid out in a kind of dispersed pattern with a bit of space between, basically. And we'll go and look up there in a second. But you can see we've got sort of here on the right, that's quite dense, but here on the left we have a nice sort of like open kind of, you know, dispersed tree placement. So it's getting towards parkland, but then a little bit denser in places, and that's fine. I mean, to have, you know, small numbers of spaces where it does sort of like come together, and obviously, you know, there has a certain aesthetic with it that a lot of people think would appreciate. And here's a good example of that kind of tree spacing we'd be looking for, that kind of open canopy. You can see that we've got trees present throughout this area. Yep. And yet, you know, the dominant herbage here is pasture species, herbaceous perennials, wildflowers, forbs, basically. And just a quick sort of image to show, you know, how the grazing management can significantly affect the diversity and the expression of that forage, basically. So when it comes to pattern selection, there's kind of 4 main options that I'm sort of pointing to here. So there's row planting, which we looked at extensively last week. There's block planting, which would be more kind of like indicative of sort of typical forestry, for example. Then this kind of dispersed or distributed planting, or even mosaic planting we've just been looking at. And then also the potential for like sort of infill. Yeah, so little corners of fields, for example, or like sort of expanding out existing plantings. So here's our sort of single and double row plantings in the top. This is the Wakelins, and here's a block planting above that. Yeah, and then there's our sort of grid planting. And again, you know, you could say grid planting and block planting are kind of the same. The difference really would be a question of spacing in this case. So your grid spacing is probably going to be more widely spaced, and your block planting is more kind of dense, if you like. The canopy will close sooner. Obviously, a block planting isn't really, we probably wouldn't say it's an agroforestry planting. We're really going much more towards forestry. As soon as we're getting that closed canopy for anything more than like a very short period, yeah, it's almost exclusively a forestry condition. So I think we've made most of these points already, but we can go beyond just straight parallel rows, and we'll look at some examples of that later on. So we can move towards curvy linear parallel patterns as well as straight parallel. So they both come under the heading of row patterns, for example. But a little bit of a recap from last week, basically, when we're designing species mixes, if we want to bring diversity like within our rows, or even within, or certainly in grid plantings, and potentially even in dispersed plantings, or although to a lesser degree in that situation, what we're looking to do basically is to match the vigor. Yeah. So willows and aspens and poplars go together quite well. Potentially vigorous alders would go together quite well, as opposed to, putting a willow with a hawthorn, for example, because the willow is just going to be like sort of head and shoulders above the hawthorn in no time, basically. And other than that, when it comes to actually sort of like calculating row spacings, if you are looking at rows, then, obviously machinery, your widest machine times 2 or times 3, for example, or if it's a sprayer, just a single unit of that potentially, so 24-meter spacing. But we've got kind of two things to think of. We've got the row width and then the tree row width as well. So that basically, in this case, the row width, the total spacing from center to center, from tree to tree, is basically the alley width plus the tree row. Yeah. So if the alley width is 24, and then your tree row basically is a meter on each side of the trees, that will give you a total of 26 meters center to center. Okay. So let's look at some design examples now. And we're going to start off with this sort of upland crofting or diversified crofting example. And there's definitely a focus on biomass production here. There's definitely a focus on shelter for a new or proposed new development, kind of housing development. There's definitely land shape to work with and slope, and plenty of open water and burns to kind of like respond to, basically. So we'll just look at some of these different examples, and we'll just get the sort of overview to begin with. So you can see here's our key down here on the left. And maybe the thing we'll start off with is this kind of wide spaced parkland that we've sort of looked at an example of earlier. So there's the key up here, for example. So we're looking at these kind of lower slopes, the kind of flatter area, and the crest of this hill, basically, because it sort of slopes around in two sides. It's kind of a shallow ridge, basically. So the flatter areas on the crest and at the base of the slope, we're looking at sort of, kind of wide spaced parkland type plantings. So a mixture of, what would effectively grow up to be standard trees, but then also potentially with some things like holly or other sort of slower growing plants that would be sort of advantageous for sort of winter browse. So there's definitely a sort of a focus on browse in this space as well. And then when we come onto the slopes, we've basically got sort of two main sections here in the top corner, and here on these slopes. Basically, we're looking at sort of parallel plantings of, in this case, browse or alley silver pasture is what I'm calling, basically. So we're kind of like, we're producing coppice poles for biomass production potentially, and for browse, and these are arranged sort of parallel, sort of moving along more or less across the slope. Yep. Then sort of the next kind of features that are sort of a bit of a recap from last week is we've got these biomass willow windbreaks that are running north to south, more or less, that are kind of coping with some of the wind that's coming along. And this, I think they're about sort of 400 meters, something like that. It's a pretty steep, it's a reasonably exposed site, even though there's some woodland here to the left. So you can see the prevailing winds coming in basically from the west here off to the left on the image. So we're kind of infilling with these hybrid willows interplanted with ivy, and the same sort of similar thing here on the western edge. In this situation, we wouldn't be interplanting with ivy. That would be more of a sort of a biomass block and nursery planting that's there to help get the conifers up and away. And then once they're doing their job, basically, we can start harvesting the willow basically as a sort of dense coppice block, basically. Then the other thing to say about the sort of coniferous planting here, so we've got 2 rows, and again, you know, we want something pretty heavy duty to deal with those prevailing winds, those strong prevailing winds, and we also want height. So we've got plenty of effect, sort of, in this case, off for the settlement here. But in this case, what we've got, so is a row of sort of cypress, fast-growing cypress on the leeward side, and then on the windward side, a row, or potentially 2 of Douglas fir. So the Doug fir will basically sort of overtop and give you sort of the really high canopy cover, wind breaking, and then the cypress will give the sort of like lower, but we're still saying that that's going to grow to sort of 20, 30 meters, that kind of thing. Just that the Doug fir will grow taller than that, basically. Okay, so next thing then we'll look at on this site are the plantings that are here along the burns, basically. So we've got a couple of burns running through the site, sort of lower down in these lower slopes. This is actually quite a steep little kind of gully through here, for example. So what we're looking to do here is introduce some riparian buffer strips, basically. So these are plantings that flank that open water and protect the stream banks. So we'll just look at examples of that now, basically. So this is sort of number 11 on the whole farm planning principles. So to protect riparian areas from stock and cropping, basically. And by doing that, we're preserving stream bank integrity and also preventing leaching. So here's an example of a field where no such measures have been taken. And in this situation, quite often, you know, people just like treat these spaces as a kind of free stock fence, basically. Maybe not so much in this case, because obviously you can see it's in a sort of a wider field, but we can see quite a bit of erosion along here. This stream is very deeply cut, so we'd say that is indicative of, again, sort of that poor stream bank integrity and just generally poor riparian condition, basically. So what would we be looking to do here? Basically, yeah, in a similar way to we were looking at just now, you know, if we allow or either allow regeneration to occur next to the stream bank, or if we plant it, then we can avoid all of this erosion, all of this slumping, and otherwise the kind of siltation of lower reaches, basically. And we can see, you know, how these two sides kind of contrast with one another. So the one on the left, there's basically no protection. There's open access from stock to the stream bank. The one on the right, there is restricted or completely eliminated access to the stream bank. So, you know, obviously we can do plantings along the stream bank and then put in, you know, permanent stock fencing, for example. But actually, you know, another simple way to do that is to either put in, again, some permanent stock fencing or something temporary. Yeah, so when the animals are in there, you're just fencing along here. You can see we've got this sort of like parallel fence along here. And again, we're going to set it back from the stream bank a decent amount. That's probably a bit close here on this side, basically. So just think of this as indicative. But you can definitely see this erosion here, for example. That's definitely indicative along here of poor stream bank integrity. But otherwise, you might look to basically sort of cut off some of the corners of these meanders, and that'll then basically fill out as a little riparian woodland, basically. Do you guys have a special name for sort of trees or woodlands that grow next to burns? If so, it'd be nice to know. Up north, we call them clough woodlands, although these tend to be more kind of like steep-sided as well as just next to streams. So yeah, these are all kind of fairly straightforward things we want to do basically, but we're looking to provide that protection fundamentally. So the next thing then we'll look at is kind of sort of drilling down into sort of how and why we would lay out these sort of patterns, these tree patterns that sort of respond to the land shape. So we've got slope that's running this way and running this way and running this way, and we've got slope sort of running this way and this way, for example. So let's just come on to another sort of more worked example, again an indicative example. This one's at totally the other end of the country, but again, how do you derive these patterns? Well, initially we look at some contours. Yeah, so the same process was done with the example we looked at before. And in this case, it's a little bit more specific in terms of the application of this particular pattern or this particular technique. So just remember here where the contours run. But basically, we've got sort of a valley running through here, kind of a shallow valley. And this is a crest. And we're sloping down to here, and we're sloping down to here, and we're sloping down to here. So basically, in this situation, as actually with all valleys, what are we seeing typically in terms of water and water movement and water concentration? It's all kind of funneling sort of off the hills, off the crests, off the ridges, down into the valleys. Yeah, so this is where the streams are running. Yeah, so whenever we have sort of excess rain or poor infiltration, for example, that water that would be on the hills basically congregates into the valleys, and you get these quite sort of like, this is when you get water rises, and in extreme cases or in poor situations, you're getting flooding basically. So there is a strategy that we can take basically to sort of bring a sort of instant fix to those kind of flooding issues, and also to redistribute any water that is moving around basically. And one of the sort of main kind of conditions is that, like, in the bottom of the valleys, the sort of low-lying areas, they tend to be very boggy and, stay wet for long periods, for example. Whereas the hills, the crests, the ridges, they tend to burn off, or if they do, they certainly burn off earlier, for example. Yeah. So one of the things we can do basically is introduce kind of a tree pattern that works with a little bit of land shaping, where we're basically placing parallel rows of trees on shallow ditches and mounds. And these ditches are like sort of no more than sort of maybe sort of 6 to 12 inches deep, and maybe like kind of 12 to 18 inches wide. So, just kind of shallow impressions basically. And then planting the trees on the upland side. And as you can see, these tree rows are parallel in these sections. Yep. So, and they're again on these little shallow ditches, and they're planted on the mounds. Basically, the trees are planted on the mounds, and the ditches on the upslope side. So, if we look at the topography of this land, yeah, we can see we've got a ridge or a hilltop here, and a ridge running down off to the left, and then we've got a valley here in the center. You can see all these little erosion gullies and rills down here, and then we've got another hilltop here, another crest with a ridge line sort of running down the middle. And one of the things that we do when we're doing this, in terms of sort of showing you how you can sort of imagine the landscape, so you can then design the landscape, is if you'll basically get your hand and make a fist. Yeah, I want you all to do this basically because it's much easier for you to do it for yourselves than me to show you. You make a fist and make like you're going to punch yourself in the face, but don't. So like, just the kind of, went back in school when they were like the big kid got your hand and started punching you in the face, like that thing. But in this case, if you look at that shape, you can see that your hand is basically made up of a series of ridges that run down the front of the fingers, yeah, and then valleys in the middle, yeah. So it sort of goes crest or hill at the top, and then ridge down the front, and then valley, ridge, valley, ridge, valley. And you see that they also descend in both dimensions. Yeah, so we see these same kind of patterns in the landscape, basically. So where we have slope, you know, there is an indication that we would respond to that with our what's it called, our plantings. But basically, what we're looking at in these situations is because these tree rows are parallel, they're not on contour. Yeah, one of them might be, one of the rows might be on contour originally, but all the ones above and below it are slightly off contour. And if you're off contour, what does that mean? It means you've got a slope along the length. Yeah, so you've got a slope from the, in this case, that's running from here in the sort of top of the valley along and out to the ridge. Yep. So from the top of the valley along and out to the ridge. Yeah, and here even more. So from here in sort of a higher place in the valley, gently sloping along here, for example, until we get to the ridge line, basically where there's a little track. So the track sort of running along sort of one of the sections of the ridge, for example. So any water that does move, any excess water, so again, we're talking like high rainfall events, basically, it will be captured as it moves down the slope, arrested in this shallow impression. Some of it will infiltrate, and the remainder will then move along the narrow channel, basically, into infiltrating as it goes because it's slowing down. And then in very extreme cases, it'll make its way all the way to here, but only in very small amounts. So rather than all the water basically concentrating off the hills down into the valley here, yep, it's then being redistributed out onto the hills. So it's actually a very easy way to establish trees. You're effectively irrigating your trees passively. So it helps them to get established. And what's been demonstrated on this farm is where they have been planted on these swales, as they call them, they've done better in terms of growth and establishment than those that were just planted on kind of on the slope, because it's all sloping, this site, basically. And just to sort of, you know, show how that so the hand thing works, basically, if we look at this particular valley, or a valley or system of valleys, you can see this is almost like that's your finger, that's your finger, that's your finger. Here's the knuckle, for example, and there's the sort of webbing between each of those, and you can see they're all sloping. Yep, and you have a little bit here at the top of the webbing, which in this case we call the key point of the valley. Yeah, and that's where the slope changes from convex to concave in the valley here. So it's convex here and concave at the base. So we're seeing erosion up here. So there's a little gully here. So that's where water is fast flowing, again, all collecting off the high ground, off the ridges. And then here, this little green patch, that's where the water slows down, and that's where the deposition occurs, basically. So all the water that's falling up here is all collecting to this central area here. So if we can collect the water up here and divert it out onto these ridges, out onto here, for example, then we can reverse that trend, basically. And we might do that with little pocket ponds that connected with these swales. So these are in the valley. This is right in the heart of the valley. You can see the valley moving down, and then that moves sort of, and then when these overflow, they'll move water out and around, basically. So when we look at that as a sort of works design, again, we would think of this as just indicative, but you can see here's the original contour. That's the one we're working from. Yeah, and all the ones, the tree rows above and below that are parallel, basically. So by the time we get up to here, you can see it's well off contour. So basically the slope is going from here, here's the high ground, and out towards here. From here out towards here. So the valley's off here, it's the middle, yep, and the slope is running this way down and out towards the ridge. Yeah. So I don't want to sort of labor this particular point too much, but basically I think the thing to say is where there is slope, for example, and particularly where those slopes are east or westerly facing, for example, then this is one pattern you might look at that is sort of like complementary to that sloping land condition, if you like. So the next heading we'll look at then, in terms of like our whole farm planning principles and moving away from the upland site we were looking at. I mean, this still is a sort of upland site that we're going to move on to now, but we've done a bit more kind of like integration or sort of concept working with products, arisings, outputs, basically. So this is where we're looking at number 10 on the whole farm planning principles. So integrate trees for productive outputs. Yeah, so livestock browse, wood chip, fruits and nuts, timber and biomass. Yep. So in this particular case, we've gone for biomass and nuts. So this planting up here will basically mostly be chestnut. Again, that's appropriate for this particular case. So it's some downland. I love the way that in the south it's called downs, and in the north it's called ups. But anyway, you know, it all basically amounts to the same thing, some kind of sloping land, basically. And in this case, we've gone for a mixture of sweet chestnut and hazelnut, which will be, you know, fruiting varieties that will be harvested potentially, or if not, then sort of like used as pannage for finishing pigs, for example. And then also coppicing on a sort of fairly short rotation to produce biomass. Yep. So before we move on to the biomass thing, I want to just sort of point to this this heading here, in situ plant breeding. So a lot of the time people would say, oh, sweet chestnuts, oh, hazel, they're not going to perform in your area. And they may not in Scotland at all, but one of the ways that you can find out whether they will is to basically do your own in situ plant breeding exercise. So you source nuts from fruiting varieties and either have them contract grown in a nursery or grow them for yourself, and then plant them out at very high density. Yeah. And when we're planting at the sort of biomass density, you know, we're talking like at least a tree per meter, if not more. You know, you potentially could be looking at, you know, 2-foot spacing, for example, and that adds up to thousands of trees per hectare, for example. So that is a significant bank of genetic stock to select from. Yeah. So this idea again comes from Mark Shepherd, the same guy we were just looking at previously, and he has bred some very interesting and very impressive varieties on his site in the northern part of the USA. You know, far beyond the regions that are known for nut production. And how's he done it? He's done it by planting thousands and thousands of different seed varieties and then selecting the best ones and then continually planting them out. Yeah. So I think there's actually a real opportunity for us to use genetics to our benefit, basically. So if we look at the sort of biomass yields, then what we're going to be looking at here in this case, so there's some housing in this example, some outdoor housing. I might just sort of like sort of go back to that image so we can show that. So we're running animals in this particular instance. So as well as the kind of basic tree pattern that we were looking at, we've also got like what I call an outdoor, what am I calling them? Green shelter or a living barn. Yeah, that's what we're calling it. So basically we've got like a little area of hard standing, for example, with some feeders and then some coniferous belts of trees on the outside, basically. So we've got, you know, pretty much the sort of cheapest kind of feeding area, winter feeding area that we could get, basically, and we could probably even get away without a concrete pad. You know, could just be a wood chip pad or some kind of mixed hardcore, potentially, obviously to your specifications. But again, you know, hardy breeds, basically heritage breeds, they don't need a roof over their head. What they need is protection from driving rain and from winter winds, basically. And you know, these kind of the shelter from an established conifer belt will provide that, and then you know a little bit of hard standing potentially, just to make access convenient and to bed up onto. So that's the sort of like one of the core uses for the biomass production on site. So again, all that material will be coppiced either from the what's it called, the alley crop here, the keyline biomass alley crop, or else from this coppice woodland here. And then the idea would be we'd use that material again, ideally for what's the word? It's like a biomass boiler. Yeah, so a batch boiler, for example, so producing hot water and heating for the homestead. Yep. And then if we're clever, we can retrofit that unit to produce biochar. Yeah, so for every unit of wood that we burn in our biomass boiler, a third or a fifth, or probably more like a quarter, as by volume, will be recovered as biochar. Yeah, and that's a form of carbon that is very recalcitrant. It's a form of black carbon, basically. So it doesn't go away, it doesn't rot down, it doesn't get respired and sent back up to the atmosphere. So we can then use that material as our bedding. Yep. Might shred it up a little bit, for example, to make sure material, but then we then use that for bedding in the living barn. Yep. And we can then spread that material using our biomass spreaders, for example, across any of these fields, and use that sort of carbon and use that as a carbon and a nutrient input to boost the organic matter of those fields, basically. Oops. And then at the same time, we also have other options with that. We could also chip up that material and use it for compost making. So the Jean Pan hot composting is one strategy for that. For example, that can also provide space heating functionality. And then some clever people have then used that to raise what's the word? Beetle larvae on. So you can use the sort of the spent compost material to produce high protein feeds for chickens and pigs, for example. So that's definitely been done out in the south of France. And then I guess the final example we'd look at here to sort of close the loop is any kind of wastewater from the house, for example, or any wash down from the living barn that would either be here or here, for example, would be directed downslope to the wastewater ecological treatment system. And that's basically a sort of shallow lagoon with sort of bunds that sort of intercept water. So the water kind of snakes down and through these bunds that are then planted with willow and other emergent species. So that's another application for trees, in this case, to provide functional sort of benefits, basically. So let's move on from that and just look at some strategies for establishing trees or protecting trees. And again, this is one of the situations or one of the reasons why row plantings really come into their own, because they are really easy to protect with temporary electric fencing. In this case, they've gone for a slight hybrid. They've got basically sort of one strainer post, maybe another one at the other end, for example, but then everything else, all the intermediate posts are all temporary. So you just basically sort of fence up the tree rows when the animals are there. Yep. And if you're working with sheep, for example, you might look at 2 or 3 strand systems. And this is one of the reasons why the Kiwi Tech system that we're looking at here, for example, is a really convenient system because it's modular. It can, the same reel can have 1, 2, or 3, or the same winder can have 1, 2, or 3 reels on it, as you like, basically. So again, really it's the spacing between the trees and this outside line that we're interested in. So that's a pretty straightforward option. And again, we need to have those lines nice and hot, basically. When it comes to planting, obviously manual planting is an option, as is regeneration potentially. So just fencing off strips of land, for example, and letting what grows grow. Yeah, I'd say those 2 options are by far the sort of cheapest in terms of investment, But yeah, if we want to plant a lot of trees in a short space of time, then the pot of put key is a sort of manual planting tool. So you just drop the thing down the tube. So you kind of step it into the ground, open the lever, that opens a thing at the base, and you drop the tree in. So that's suitable for plug-grown plants or cell-grown plants. And then the full-on tree planter, basically, that is fairly easy to make. It's just kind of a subsoilish shoe with a boot on the back of it with an open slot, and then some press wheels, and then like an operator to sit on the back and place the trees. And to know when you plant the trees, you have a chain that hangs off the back that's the length of the spacing between the individual trees. So you just look down until the chain hits the end of the last tree and then drop the next one in. And for larger trees, things like fruit trees and that kind of thing, then augering is also indicated. Okay. So when it comes to establishment, there's various different options, like mowing and spraying, for example, if you're non-organic, would be indicated. But I think probably the simplest option is to use rolled out round bales of straw, for example. Yep. And either planting through that, if it's things like willow rods, yep, you can pretty much plant straight between that. Or if you've got larger trees to plant, or you want to work with the tree planter, then you basically be putting two bales, one on each side. Yep. Obviously, there's a cost with that, as with any loose mulching systems, but it will definitely help with establishment. And I would say that like mulching is the go-to solution for establishing trees, basically. You know, it's those first 2 years of formative growth that's kind of make or break. Yeah. So don't think of investment into the plantings as being solely the trees or solely the guards. Yeah, we also need to look at establishment, basically. And things like side discharge spreaders are definitely indicated. I think also potentially feeder bedders might work with this as well, although I've not experimented with that. But again, you know, you've got the chute along the side there, so you just drive along the tree row and kind of earth up, if you like, but in this case with a mulch. Main thing to point to make is it's important not to be mounding up lots of sort of damp mulch right next to the trees, because and the stems basically, because that'll introduce rot. So if you're using spiral guards or any other kind of tree guard that's sort of completes to the base, then that sort of eliminates that issue, basically. So that's another reason to use spiral guards. Okay. Another thing we can be looking at is applying microbe foods, using that, making dips, for example, applying good quality compost like aerobic compost, for example, or dipping the roots in molasses or other or humic acids, these kind of things, like a food source for the organisms that will colonize the roots, and helping to speed that up, potentially even also mycorrhizal fungi. But actually, I would say it's better to go and get yourself some soil from around some healthy plants, grind that up, and make that into a sticky mix, maybe with some humic acid or some molasses. And otherwise, we can be looking at microbes as well as that, things like effective microbes, EM. They all add to the establishment, basically. And yeah, we've talked about these, the coppicing and biochar sort of like synthesis, basically. The one thing that I would say is that what's it called? Yeah, if you want to produce volume quantities of biochar, but without the potential to heat recover from the process, then you can use pit kilns, for example. So just shallow, but not even necessarily that shallow pits that you're loading in dry material into, and then burning them down till you start seeing embers. So you burn them down to embers, and then you keep adding more material, keep burning down just to embers, and then adding to the point of the pit filling up, at which point you quench it. So fill the pit with water, basically. Okay, so are there any questions we've looked at so far?
We have a couple questions. So I think that the first one is, it looks asking, which would be better for winter bedding in an outdoor barn? Would it be wood chip or biochar?
I'm not sure if better really qualifies in this heading, basically. I think it's unlikely that you're ever going to, well, at least in the short term, unless you're investing pretty heavily in biochar production, I think you're unlikely to be producing the kinds of quantities that you need for a whole winter of bedding. Yeah. That's not to say that, like, you know, some amendments, some additional biochar into the, what's it called? Into the bedding pack isn't efficacious. I think it is. But, you know, it's one of these things that, like, you've got to use what you've got. And you'll need a lot of biochar basically to do the whole winter on them. That said, biochar is a much higher carbon content than wood chip. Yep, because it's 100% carbon. Yeah. And when it comes to bedding up, what are you trying to do fundamentally? You're trying to balance the nitrogen that's coming out of the back end of the animal with carbon. Yeah. Thus, maintaining a complete breakdown, basically composting in situ. So the more carbon you can put down, the better. And which sort of biochar is the most carbon rich material you can get your hands on, because obviously it's 100% carbon. Okay, next question.
Alison's asking, she's looking for advice on planting in areas of quite high density bracken.
Yeah, I don't know really. I probably would need to know a little bit more information. What's the sort of objectives? What are the areas? But yeah, I mean, it's gonna be, plantings, agroforestry plantings are part of a wider kind of, I guess, sort of land management practice. So, are you going to be, what are you going to be doing between the trees, basically? Are you going to be grazing? Are you going to be cropping? What are you going to be doing, basically? So, I would basically look at that particular sort of starting point and then sort of work out from that, basically. So is it going to be pigs? Is it going to be what's it called? Sheep, for example. And in that situation, that's how we're getting control of the bracken. Yeah, or in partners, as part of that work. And then, we'd look at sort of introducing trees. So probably later on. One of the things I actually didn't mention earlier that I think is nice to point to, again, with this particular example, which is, again, it's really just a sort of a concept design as opposed to like a fully worked design. Yeah, so we're also going to be using the material we're chipping from our biomass coppice production for growing mushrooms potentially, and also using it potentially as an input, as an amendment for our pastures. So in this situation, some of these pastures are quite poor, have quite poor production, basically. So I'm going to try and improve the organic matter by doing that. Also subsoiling along the rows. Yep, helping to root prune those trees and give additional infiltration of water movement between the trees in the alleys, basically. And then also what's really interesting as well to me is the use of poultry or fowl as a tree establishment tool. As you can see, there's young fruit trees here, and what we're using is the sort of the targeted animal feeding option in this situation. So basically, that means you kind of, obviously, if you're running free range chickens and you're rotating them, which you can be, sort of up and down the alleys, what you can do is spread the feed around the base of the trees where you want them to scratch and where you want them to manure, basically. So that's another establishment technique that you can look at along with chicken tractors as well, basically. Okay.
Great. And we have one last one. which is when designing a spectrum of open to closed canopy in a silvopasture system, what would be your key considerations?
Sorry, I just realized I wasn't sharing my screen just a minute ago. So yeah, just ask that question again, please.
So when designing a spectrum of open to closed canopy in a silvopasture system, what would be your key considerations?
Again, it's the grazing management. You'd always start from the grazing management and work back, basically. So what animals are you using? How are you managing them? You know, is it on a rotational system? Is it on a set stocking system, for example? You know, are we working with permanent fencing? Or are we working with temporary fencing, basically? And we're basically going to be fitting in sort of extended rest periods in sort of patches. That's effectively what we're doing, basically. And you know, if it's a sort of parkland situation, then we you know, some people physically guard up individual trees. I think that looks horrible personally, but does give the kind of authentic parkland kind of sort of impression, basically, or aesthetic, and that's appropriate for a set stocking situation. But actually, you know, if we're getting down with our what's it called, electric fencing, then we can actually sort of make kind of shapes, for example. So I would like do a bit of design work using something like field margin to get you going. Let's see if we can get that up. Have we got you here? Yep. I'll just see if I can find. Well, in fact, we could. Oops. Come back to the site we were looking at a minute ago. So let's just share the screen now and move to the Bing satellite image. So yeah, you can see we've got various kind of slopes and various patterns here. So we've already gone ahead and broken up the space into its kind of more component parts. So we've got a crest here, we've got slopes around each side, for example, you know, where the sort of rushes and bracken are. These are slopes, for example, and then we've got flat areas. So we'd already divide those areas probably up into their sort of topographic subdivisions, for example, and then, you know, we'd potentially look at expanding some of these existing trees, you know, maybe planting a few trees around them, potentially sort of like guarding sections of that whole thing, or fencing it out in a sort of temporary period. Again, the challenge really with distributed patterns is integrating the grazing management going forwards, because, you know, once you've fenced out an area either temporarily or permanently, then you don't have a lot of options for controlling sort of weed growth or grass growth around those trees, basically. So I guess we're probably looking for fairly narrow plantings, even if they're not actually complete long rows, for example. So we can still graze close to those individual trees, for example, to get them going. Yeah. Or we just sort of like kind of throw our hands up in the end and say, well, we're not so worried, basically. So we'll fence out this area and it's going to go to scrub. Yep. It's not going to give us sort of a mature tree in the same kind of period of time as, you know, a parkland planting, but it's definitely going to bring habitat and shelter and shade and browse and all these other factors, basically. So I think that the first step really is to do a little bit of designing, yeah, and just design a little bit in response to the land shape. So we can look at that maybe a little bit more when we look at this sort of worked example here. So again, this is that same site. You can't see it so well, but if we just switch between them, you can see here's that road coming round. So let's just sort of move it over. So we're looking at about the same thing. So you can see we've divided it into sort of 2 or 3 main areas, for example. And you see we've got our sort of clumps of trees. So really, it's about a little bit of design, some establishment practices, and then some fencing options, basically. So hopefully that covers that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we can continue.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just in that case going to come back to that design I was talking about earlier, but realized I wasn't sharing the screen. So again, looking down in this bottom left, so using wood chip harvested from the copies, we can use that to grow mushrooms. Yep, so that's another way to upcycle those raw materials. We can also be subsoiling, either with either with a fancy sort of multi-tine thing, or even just with just one tine, for example. And the fewer tines, the less horsepower, the less weight. And then we're basically ripping parallel with the trees, and that root prunes the trees and also helps to provide more of these sort of water channels, these little small drainage channels to move water along out to the ridges. And then this here is the example I was mentioning of targeted animal feeding, and you can see where the birds are sort of collected around each of these trees. Obviously, this has been done manually in this case, and if that's how you apply the feed, normally that's fine. But one way to sort of automate that would be to have a quad-mounted spreader, feed spreader, with a chute that you can angle, basically. And often you can get ones that are sort of motor operated with a clicker on the quad, on the handle of the quad. Basically, they often use them for shoots. Shoots often use them for like applying feed for pheasant feeders, basically. And I think basically we can use that same thing, or just basically drive along the tree row, spitting out feed along the base. You could even like be a bit sneaky and mix the feed like 50-50 with sawdust or something like that, so it'll have the appearance of feed and encourage the animals to obviously you're still going to put the right amount of feed out for them, but you could double the amount of area covered and double the amount of interest. So if it looks like feed, they're going to go over and they're going to scratch and they're going to manure in these areas, basically. And that's what we're trying to do, basically, is fertilize our young trees and control weeds around the base. Okay, so the last thing I want to do now is to do a little bit of a design demo, basically. And in this case, we're looking at a site where we have an established horticulture operation and also a sort of diversified hospitality and retail sort of enterprise on site. So that is sort of one of the kind of main sort of criteria in terms of sort of species selection or system selection. So I'm going to now look at the design tools that I work with. And again, here is our sort of horticulture block down in this bottom corner. North is to the top, so the map is normally orientated with north to the top, and it is in this case. And I've sort of, got you going, if you like. So I've put in just one example row of sort of biomass willow, for example, interplanted with ivy. So that's going to provide protection from westerly winds. We might extend that along the top. We might even put another row on the outside here because there's a little kind of sort of chicken free range enclosure along here. So that's sort of a nice bit of integration. So then what we're going to look at is kind of integrating these rows of trees. In this case, we're talking about sort of like orchard trees, productive fruit trees, basically, probably on something like semi-vigorous rootstocks, growing to about 4 meters across, something like that. So again, the lines that we're looking at here, I'm not sure how accurate they are or how representative they are, basically. But that is, I didn't like that. Anyway, we're basically using them as an indicative thing to just represent where tree rows might go to, basically. So I don't think those rows are far off. So what we will look at then is the spacing between these rows. I've just done a couple here, just sort of as indicative. And again, they're sort of orientated north to south. So let's just look at what that spacing is. Yeah, so it's about 16 meters. And I was thinking that would be a sort of fairly nice sort of halfway house, basically. Obviously, the trees are going to spread to 4 meters. And really, what the critical thing here is that you have a uniform number of beds, basically, in between the tree rows. So basically it'd be tree row and then sort of like 10 beds, 15 beds, for example, depending on the width, and then a path, and then the next tree row, basically. So those are your main considerations. So we're just going to take an offset here and put in that distance as 16 meters, center to center. And then we just basically extend this pattern across the site. So maybe let's just select it first. Doesn't quite like doing this work live. So try and select this line. There we go. And then we hit our offset tool. Then it just basically copies that same line at that prerequisite 16 meter spacing. So we just copy that pattern across the site, basically. And there we have basically quite a simple, quite a quick sort of integrated fruit production into an existing horticultural operation. You know, ideally we would sort of plan that at the beginning, you know, so we make sure that it works with the bed widths and the access paths and all that kind of thing, basically. So this is just a sort of indicative example. And again, sort of having very straight north-south rows is also highly indicated. You're going to get the most sunlight down those rows by doing that. But then we probably would say, well, is that too much? You know, how much fruits, how much top fruit do our customers actually want relative to the amount of veg we're producing? How much can we pick? How much can we store? You know, because obviously the picking and the storage or the picking and the sales need to sort of like match up. But if we are basically producing sort of a decent quantity, more than we'd be able to sell basically in the season, then we'd need to select varieties that kept well, for example, and then pick them as a batch and then store them and then put them in boxes, for example, or sell them sort of like week on week as we go into the winter season, basically. So that's one side, and that's basically be sort of effectively a horticulture alley cropping planting. The next thing we could look at then for the open field here to the west, to the east of the existing horticulture operation is something like an undergrazed orchard. Maybe on standards like this example here. So we've got like cattle height, you know, sort of 6 foot to branching, for example, or it could be a little bit lower. But in this case, as you can see, we've got like this space being used as a car park. Yep. This area here off to the west is a bit wet, so we probably would leave that out, or potentially put a wet system in there, for example, and maybe some windbreaks along this edge. Yep. We're obviously potentially going to be having issues with snow drifting onto this main access way, so we potentially would put something in here that would be either temporary or living to catch and drift that snow. And again, a porous structure drifts snow on the leeward side, so we need to have a planting or a structure that was a little way back from the fence, the existing fence line, and thus use that little buffer area, that little strip basically next to the existing fence as the place to drift up the snow. But if we're looking at, you know, tree planting in this space, then probably, you know, just a fairly standard kind of grid planting, you know, fairly wide spaced, standards or half standards, for example, so we can still park cars in between them. We've still got our kind of rows of avenues, for example. Then I guess the other thing is that often using this space to put large marquees. So we'd design a pad, like, so there might be sort of 2 big pads for large marquees, for example. So we'd probably be looking at more of these kind of peripheral areas being, you know, suitable for perhaps more denser plantings. But again, you know, where we've got this sort of mixed use space, we would want to do a bit of design work design work, design work around access, for example, and trying to work up probably, I would say, 2 or 3 sort of worked examples that can then be critiqued on and then condensed into one that might get taken forward. And it may even be that it's done in a kind of phased approach. So you do a little bit of area to begin with. It's quite safe. See how that works. Does it fit with what we think what I think it does? And then we can gradually sort of roll that out to the remainder of the site. But again, you know, the fact that they are that have hospitality here, for example, there would be a demand for top fruit, both from the horticulture area and potentially from this main area as well, particularly if they're sort of value adding, for example, you know, catering, sort of like production with, you know, plums or apples or stuff like that, for example. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to say, as we are to here basically. So maybe let's leave that up now and invite any questions based on what has been said so far.
That was great. Thanks, Neil. We have one question first from Nat, asking what software were you showing there? What were you using to create those images?
Yeah. Okay. In this case, this particular one is called Vectorworks, but it's just another CAD package basically. It's pretty fully featured and it works well basically, but it's pretty steep learning curve and it does way more than it needs to for your purposes. So I probably would suggest, at least, I mean, I don't know what your kind of applications are or what your needs are, but you know, in the short term, you know, working with stuff on field margin, you know, is an option. So you can basically create kind of basic polygons and basic fields, for example. Suddenly my computer's gone really slow. But let's see if we can, so we can kind of like kind of run across here, for example, following what we think is a slope, or we can switch to the Ordnance Survey, for example, and that shows us, you know, more of, you know, some of the slope that's going on there, for example, so we could follow along that contour. And down, oops, to the existing field boundary, for example.
Can you share the screen, Niels?
Oh God, sorry. Yeah, I need to get in there early, basically. Missed that entire demo. Yeah, so again, maybe we'll just come out of this. Just cancel that for the moment, and I'll show that again. So again, we're in the Ordnance Survey view now, and we could basically create some lines. Use the existing contours, for example, to indicate some spaces or potential tree lines, for example. So that'd be like just one, and let's just call it, give it, oops, that's the wrong thing to do. Hopefully it didn't do that. Okay, great. So for some reason it's not liking that. Anyway, okay, because I haven't clicked it off. There we go. So we save that, or again, you know, using our aerial image, we could potentially sort of, you know, sort of section off some areas into like sort of a polygon, for example. So we've got some kind of basic design tools here, and just finish that again. Oops. Or, you know, we could, like some of these, there's a couple of I don't know why that's not showing, but anyway, we could do a bit of an area around one of these trees, one of these like spinnies, for example. So just along here, and we can zoom in, just using pinch and zoom. And by doing that, that's calculated the area that we're working with, for example. Unfortunately, it doesn't show us the perimeter because it's joined. But otherwise, you can be using sort of Google Earth to do stuff like this as well. It's not quite as elegant, but it has a few more, what's the word, features, basically. So I'm afraid I can't really recommend much else, unfortunately. I'm trying to persuade people like Field Margin and people like AgriWeb potentially to sort of look at some of these more specialized design tools or design features, I should say. But yeah, hopefully that answers some of that question. It was a little bit unsatisfactory, I know,
yeah.
but
and if someone wants to see any of those things, they can support you, or sort of like just let you know, so that you can actually go back to them and see, yeah, there is interest here. Just see all those people are interested in it. So just let us know.
Okay, great.
I have another question, and that is for different kinds of trees. Are there specific optimum sizes for planting? So for fruit trees or for protection trees?
Sort of no, I would say, is the answer to that question. But obviously they come in different ages and different sizes. And generally speaking, things like fruit trees will be sort of 2-year-old plants, or they'll certainly be a lot more mature, for example, than like a forestry whip would be. And certainly most conifers will come pot grown. So there's a like additional expense with that. So I would say, it's really about your budget, to be honest. Your budget and your kind of aspirations. If you've got sort of a fairly sort of high aspirations and you want to achieve something in the short term, then you're probably going to be looking at like spending more, basically. If you've got a little bit more time to sort of nurture your trees and sort of go the extra yard, then you can go with establishment, then you can go for smaller, younger trees, basically. But I would say that those are the main trade-offs. If you go for cheap trees, they're going to be young and small, so more susceptible to vole damage, to slug damage, even potentially to sort of drought conditions or wet winters. But obviously, yeah, you can do more meters. You can plant more densely in that situation. Whereas with fruit tree, whereas if you wanted to go for more, you basically would spend more money, then you're looking at like more established trees that would tend to be more competitive, generally speaking. They'll take longer to plant, yeah, or need more sort of more intervention when it comes to planting. But otherwise, yeah, those are the main considerations at this stage, I would say.
That's great. I'm not sure if anybody, here's another question from Luke. Is there any info or links to wood chip boilers that have been retrofitted for biochar?
No, is the answer to that question. But it can be done fairly simply, and I would say safely. But basically, you can have a retort fabricated, basically. The best sort of way to think of it is as the biscuit tin method. So I would suggest going out there and checking out that on YouTube, basically. But if you take a metal box or metal tin, basically, with a sort of fairly close fitting lid, drill some holes in it, fill it with combustible material, ideally fairly fine but also dry. You place that into an existing fire, basically, enclosed in a burner. Yep. That could occupy anything up to 2/3 of the firebox. So you've got an existing fire in the main firebox, and then you place a sort of magazine of combustible material with, you know, sort of not necessarily a tight fitting lid, but a closer fitting lid, and then some holes drilled in the top, basically. Yeah, you place that into a hot fire or into a batch burner. It then fires the burner as normal. That creates the heat inside the box or inside the tin, basically. That drives off the gases. Yep. Which then combust because it's nice and hot. Again, you want to run a nice hot burn, basically. So you burn off all the gases, and because you've got a fitting lid and some holes, but basically an enclosed space, it's very hard, and heat escaping constantly. It's very hard for oxygen to enter the interior of that box, basically. So you can do a batch burn, maybe have a couple of these vessels, basically, and then when that's burnt down, when the flames are gone, if it is just a sort of like a sort of a stove, then you can remove that tin. It will be very hot. Place it on the hearth, for example. Cover those holes. I normally just put, like, when I did it, again, this is all small scale stuff and it's all indoors. You cover it with pennies or 2p's, for example, something to stop the oxygen getting back in there, basically, and let it cool. And once it's cool, you can transfer it into a storage vessel, basically, and you can build that up. You know, every night that you've got the stove running, basically, you can be producing biochar. That's the basic premise for retrofitting an existing stove, and that can be done. I would say that could be done to any size, basically, right from like a sort of straw boiler down to like a sort of, you know, kind of glass fronted wood stove, basically. The only other person I would probably point to is this guy Ed Revel, who's based out towards Swansea, and he does make some very impressive, mostly cook stoves, but not exclusively. They're sort of hand built cook stoves and space heaters. They're all quite small scale, so you wouldn't think of them as a boiler, basically. But the cook stoves are really interesting. When they get going, they are so hot. I might see if I can actually find a photograph of one of them on the go whilst we're talking, basically. But they produce, like, you know, insane amounts of heat, and produce biochar, basically. So if you want to cook meals, you know, let's say, you know, in an outdoor kitchen, for example, or just in the field, using kind of like twigs, brash, wood chip that's been dried, basically, or seasoned, then that's the way to go, basically. So I think the thing about biochar, again, is tricky because you have got to find the right kind of sort of bit of kit, basically. But if we can integrate it into an existing operation or existing heating or cooking practice, then every time we do this, then every time we cook, every time we heat, we can make biochar, basically. So I've got an image to show now, even though it's all very slow. So again, this is just the home burner option. So you can see the biscuit tin with the gases coming out, leaking out around the side and jetting out of the holes drilled in the top. And that's what it looks like without the flash, basically. So we're just enclosing that sort of. We're basically cooking wood. Thanks, Johnny. Someone's on it. You're gonna have to tell me, basically, when I'm not doing this. So here's the example. You know, without the flash, you can see the sort of gases escaping around the edge of the lid. Yeah, it's like it is basically a sort of biscuit tin type thing, a metal. In fact, in this case, it was a although this is all small scale stuff, so it's not directly relevant, but stainless steel tin, holes drilled in the top, and you can see all that. So there's gases jetting out, basically. And then there's various examples of pit kilns and varying scales. So you can see people have been sort of scaling these kind of materials up, basically. But obviously none of this or very little of this is incorporates heat recovery, which I think is pretty important, to be honest. But where we get down with these types of processes, then we can actually be creating wow, that is a tiny photo, terra preta type soils. We can be sort of fast tracking those high carbon soils. So I think it's Plagan on the right, which comes from the actually no, I think this is actually the Amazonian soil. So yeah, we're kind of fundamentally what we're trying to do here is produce what they call anthrosols, which are sort of human-made soils as opposed to human-degraded soils. But yeah, we might look at some examples of that shortly. So yeah, so I'll come out of that. Yeah, any other sort of points?
No, I think, and we're right on time as well.